The tunnel air is dead. It hasn't moved in 300 years. Amenpanufer lifts his chisel. He usually carves hieroglyphs praising the pharaoh. Tonight he breaks. His copper tool taps against the sealed doorway, precise and quiet. This is not discovery. It is a return. This place was never meant to be entered again. This was the Valley of the Kings. Yet nearly every tomb was violated. Who were these phantoms with impossible knowledge? The greatest threat wasn't an army. It was the very men who built the tombs. What happens when the world's most sacred trusts are broken? And what does that say about the promises you rely on every day? To understand what happens next, you need to picture this valley not as the sun-bleached tourist site you have seen in photographs, but as it was in the 12th century BC, a restricted zone, a sacred and secret military installation for the dead. This is the west bank of the Nile, across from the sprawling city of Thebes, the religious capital of the Egyptian Empire. For nearly 500 years, during a period known as the New Kingdom, this was the chosen burial ground for pharaohs, whose names still echo in history. Seti I, Ramesses II, Thutmose III. The decision to bury them here was a direct response to a catastrophic failure. The Great Pyramids of the Old Kingdom, magnificent and obvious on the horizon, had proven to be little more than treasure maps for tomb robbers. The Valley of the Kings was the solution. Hide the tombs deep within the earth, in a remote, easily guarded canyon of sheer rock cliffs. The entrances were to be sealed, buried, and forgotten, their locations a state secret known only to a select few. The workers themselves, a highly specialized community of artisans and laborers, lived in a walled village called Deir el-Medina, isolated to ensure their silence. Every detail was engineered for one purpose: to protect the divine body of the pharaoh, ensuring his journey through the underworld and his role in maintaining the cosmic order of the universe. For a time, it seemed to work, but the universe had other plans. The golden age of the New Kingdom was ending, and the shadows were beginning to lengthen over the empire, leading to a secret that would unravel everything. The rot began not with a bang, but with a ledger book. By the reign of Ramesses III, around 1186 BC, the Egyptian Empire was overextended and bleeding wealth. Wars against the mysterious sea peoples to the north and Libyan tribes to the west had drained the treasury. The intricate supply lines that fed the nation began to fray, and the first people to feel it were the men of Deir el-Medina, the tomb builders. To understand their mindset, you must understand their contract with the state. They were not slaves. They were elite, state-employed craftsmen, paid in rations of grain, fish, and beer. This was not just food. It was their salary, their livelihood, their connection to the divine order they served. Then the shipments started coming late, first a week, then a month. The official records preserved on papyrus document the growing desperation. A scribe reportedly wrote that the workers had been without their grain rations for 20 days. You can almost feel the heat and the hunger in his words. This led to the first recorded labor strike in human history. The men laid down their tools, the very tools meant to build eternity for their kings, and marched out of their village. They walked to the mortuary temples on the plain, the grand monuments to the pharaohs they served, and they sat down. They chanted a simple, devastating phrase: "We are hungry." The local officials were panicked. A vizier promises payment, secures a delayed shipment, and the men go back to work. But the problem isn't solved. It only gets worse. Under the later Ramesside kings, the state's authority collapses further. Inflation becomes rampant. Official documents show the price of a single sack of emmer wheat skyrocketing from 1 daban of copper to 8, then 16, then 24. The system that had held Egypt together for millennia was breaking its most fundamental promise: to provide. And in the quiet, dust-filled huts of Deir el-Medina, after dark, the whispers began. The men who knew the secrets of the valley, who had spent their lives cutting the false passages and painting the hidden chambers, began to talk. They knew the layout of every tomb better than anyone alive. They knew the rituals, they knew the security, and most importantly, they knew it was all an illusion. If you had been in that village, listening in the dark, you would have heard the sound of faith curdling into a plan. Here is the detail that would have made your blood run cold. They weren't just guessing. They had the blueprints, memorized in their own minds and muscles. The worst part hadn't happened yet. And this is where the story stops making sense. This wasn't about politics. The official story is that desperate men did desperate things. But the tomb robbery papyri, the actual court documents from the trials of these men, tell a far more personal story. This was about betrayal on a cosmic scale. Meet a man named Amenpanufer. He was a quarryman, one of the men who cut the very stone for the tombs. His confession, taken under interrogation, survives. He details, in flat, administrative language, how he and his small gang of conspirators broke into the tomb of a 17th dynasty king, Sobekemsaf II. They tunneled through the rock for days, their oil lamps sputtering in the stale air. When they finally broke through, they found the pharaoh and his queen. What they did next was not simple theft. Amenpanufer confessed that they stripped the royal mummies of their gold collars, their amulets, their golden masks. They tore the precious metals from the linen wrappings that were meant to preserve the divine flesh for eternity. Then, they took the coffins themselves, inlaid with gold and silver, and they reportedly set them on fire. You must understand what this means. To an ancient Egyptian, the body was the vessel for the soul's eternal life. The coffin was its home. To burn them was to destroy the pharaoh's chance at immortality, to erase him from the cosmic cycle. It was the ultimate act of sacrilege, committed by a man who had been raised from birth to believe in that sacred cycle. Think about the most sacred idea you hold, something you believe is untouchable and absolute. Now imagine the cold, gnawing emptiness it would take for you to be the one to douse it in oil and set it ablaze, just to scrape the melted gold from the ashes. But the true extent of this betrayal was far more organized than anyone suspected. Here's where it gets worse. The horror of that act feels personal, chaotic, a singular crime of desperation. But that is the most dangerous misunderstanding you could have. This was not chaos. It was a business. As investigators under Ramesses IX began to round up suspects, the confessions revealed something terrifying. A coordinated systemic conspiracy. Amenpanufer's gang was just one of many. These weren't small groups of starving men acting on impulse. They were organized cells, each with specialists. The stonemasons who knew how to breach the walls silently, the coppersmiths who could melt down the stolen gold, the water carriers who acted as lookouts. And the network extended far beyond the workers' village. The papyri name names. They describe how stolen goods were funneled to fences, merchants who would launder the sacred artifacts into untraceable bullion. More damningly, the confessions implicate the very officials tasked with protecting the valley. Scribes who falsified records, temple priests who looked the other way, guards who sold information on patrol schedules. The conspiracy reportedly went all the way to the top. The chief suspect in organizing this entire criminal enterprise was a man named Pharaoh, the mayor of West Thebes himself, the highest-ranking official in the region. When the vizier from the capital launched an investigation, Pharaoh obstructed it at every turn. Witnesses were intimidated. Evidence vanished. The official inquiry became a sham, a theatrical performance designed to fail. And here is what should make you deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't a rebellion against the system. This was the system revealing its true function when put under pressure. The men at the bottom stole to survive. The men at the top organized the theft to profit. It is a pattern you have seen before, in every institution that rots from the inside out. But none of that prepared anyone for the devastating choice the priests made next, a choice that would redefine the very meaning of tomb robbery. The priests made a devastating choice. They decided to rob the tombs themselves. This wasn't about greed, it was about preservation, but a preservation so brutal it was almost indistinguishable from desecration. What the priests did next was the part they worked hardest to bury, because it was the final admission of defeat. They realized the robberies could not be stopped. The authority of the state was gone. The sanctity of the valley was a memory, and the guardians themselves were the wolves. So, under the priest kings of the 21st dynasty, the authorities made a devastating choice. They decided to rob the tombs themselves. This wasn't about greed, it was about preservation, but a preservation so brutal it was almost indistinguishable from desecration. In a series of clandestine, state-sanctioned operations, teams of priests and officials entered every known tomb in the valley, including those of the greatest pharaohs like Seti I and Ramesses II. They opened the sarcophagi, they unwrapped the royal mummies, and with the methodical precision of accountants, they stripped them of every remaining piece of gold, every amulet, every last vestige of their divine wealth. They documented it all on dockets that still survive, listing the items salvaged from the bodies of their gods. Then, they took the naked, unadorned bodies of these once mighty rulers and moved them. They carried them by night out of their magnificent, eternal homes and hid them in secret, unmarked caches. The most famous of these, a rough-hewn, undecorated tomb known as DB 320, was discovered in 1881. Inside, piled together in a tangled, anonymous heap, were the bodies of over 50 of Egypt's greatest kings and queens. What you now understand, and what most people never will, is that this story is not about criminals breaking into tombs. It is about the protectors realizing the tomb was already empty. The magic was gone. The faith that powered the civilization was broken. And all that was left to do was liquidate the assets and hide the evidence of their failure. The answer to the question you have been sitting with this entire video is this. The greatest security system in the ancient world was not defeated by a flaw in its design, but by a flaw in human nature. It happened because the social contract that held Egyptian civilization together for 3,000 years had been irrevocably broken. The state, embodied by the pharaoh, had promised its people Mayat, cosmic order, justice, and prosperity. When the state could no longer provide prosperity, its people stopped believing in its justice, and the cosmic order collapsed into a free-for-all. The insiders became the greatest threat because they were the ones who had been closest to the illusion. They had mixed the plaster, carved the stone, and painted the promises of eternity on the walls. They were the first to know it was all just a story. And why does this story feel so personal to you? Because every society, every institution you rely on is built on a similar set of promises. Promises of security, of fairness, of a stable future. The tombs were not robbed by monsters. They were robbed by ordinary men who had been promised a place in a divine order. And when that order abandoned them, they simply took what they felt they were owed. We return to that man in the tunnel, Amenpanufer, his face lit by the flickering flame of his lamp. The hand that lifts the chisel to break the seal of his god's tomb is the same hand that once carved that god's praises into stone. The ultimate treasure in the Valley of the Kings was never the gold or the lapis lazuli. It was the shared belief in an eternal, unshakable order. And when that was plundered, it could never be recovered. The famous tomb of Tutankhamun survived not because of its curses or its clever design, but by sheer dumb luck. It was accidentally buried under the debris from a later tomb's construction and simply forgotten. The systems we build to protect the things we value most are fragile. Sometimes the only thing that saves them is being overlooked. The next time you walk past an institution you believe is permanent, a government, a bank, a religion, remember the sound of that quiet, precise tapping in the dark. The real threat is never the barbarian at the gates. It is the guardian on the inside who has simply stopped believing.
Tell me in the comments, which part of this stayed with you?